Hello and welcome! I'm Adam with Pushing the Envelope, the channel that gives you everything artificial intelligence and machine learning. Welcome to a special bonus episode of this Python Bootcamp where we're going to be exploring errors. Now, errors are a very common thing that you run into whether you're a beginner or you're an expert coder. But what you really need to understand is what the error is telling you and where it is within your code so you can go back and fix it. If you can learn that lesson, you're going to be a way better coder because even someone like me who's been coding for a very long time runs into errors all the time. And it really comes down to how fast you can fix those errors is how good of a coder you can actually become. So without further ado, I have some example problems lined up where the code has some error. We're going to be looking at the code, looking at the errors we get, and seeing if we can hunt down those errors. So let's jump over to Jupyter and we will begin. As with all these videos, if you would like to follow along, I do have this link on the very top to the GitHub. I also have it in the description, but it is not super necessary for this tutorial specifically. We're going to be using some code I have already coded out, so it may be useful if you want to not have to code each one of these cells, but you can also just code exactly what I have in here and you'll get the same results. So I have a whole bunch of examples here. All of these have some sort of error, and we're going to run these one by one and see what the error is saying and figure out where it actually is within the code. Now, as you notice, I have my line numbers showing. You can actually go into the settings of whatever interpreter you're using. If they're not already a default, you can turn on line numbers, and those will sort of help you figure out where exactly your error is occurring. So let's jump into this first one. So for some reason, this statement is not printing. If we run the cell, you can see we are getting an error. Now it's pointing to this very first line where we're setting the name to be my name. And the error says EOL, which means end of line, while scanning string literal. This means it hit the end of the line before the string was closed. So for some reason, this string is not closing. If we look at it, we have a single quotation mark followed by the name followed by a double quotation mark. When you're defining a string, you can either use single or double quotation marks, but you cannot mix the two. So you either need to make them both doubles or make them both singles. So if I fix that, we'll run it again. Now we're getting another error, but it's not the same error that we had before. So we did fix the first one, but we are getting something else. So it says invalid syntax. If you look at the line, it's our print statement. And if you look at this little caret, it's telling you exactly where the error is. So somewhere between a name and your number is. And if you look, all of these are separated by commas at the beginning. So we either need a comma or we need a plus sign in order to do string math here. So let's add in that comma and run it again. Now again, hitting a third error. Let's see. It's a different part of the print statement. It's highlighting your number is plus number. And the error is you can only concatenate a string, not an integer, to a string, which means we are trying to add a number and a string together, which will not work for string math. If you come up here to the print statement, our number is equal to 1351, which is an integer. If we want to do string math, we need to cast that string, the number, into a string. And so that is where our error is lying. Now if we run it, our sentence has finally printed out correctly. So again, it's really all of this is about reading what those errors are saying, where it's pointing, going back to your code to figure out why exactly it's broken. Okay. Now we have this list. If we run the list, for some reason we're trying to print the list out at the index, but it is not printing. So we get this pointer here. It's looking at the fourth line, and it says something about expected and indented block. Now, if you remember using for loops, if statements, functions, anything that ends in a colon, anything you want to do needs to be indented. And so if we go to print and we tab this over, which is not working for me, if I just go ahead and move this up, all right, there we go, indented. So now we have our print statement indented. Now if I run this, you can see our list has printed out. Okay, so solved the first two. Let's keep on moving through this. We have this if statement, and for some reason it's printing wrong. So if I run this, it is printing something, so we're not getting an error. But as you can see, we are using a 1 here, and it's printing out that x is between 5 and 10. So if you look at this if statement, If x is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 5, which it is, then our message should be x is between 0 and 5. We have this next if statement, though, that says if x is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 10, we're saying x is between 5 and 10. Okay, a couple of different things we can do here. We can either change the lower bound to be 5, but what's more efficient is if we change this to an elif. Now, remember, elif, and change this last one to elif as well. An elif is going to say, if this first condition fails, move on to the second. So even if the number is 1, and we go and pass in here, it's not going to run the second one because it's already passed the first. So that's one way to get around it. So now if I run it, you can see, okay, x is between 0 and 5. That's great. Let's test some other numbers, though. Let's try 0, between 0 and 5. Great. Let's test 20. Okay, now it's printing out x is between 0 and 5. So still something is wrong here. And if we look, it's not actually passing this first statement. The reason it's printing x is between 0 and 5 is because it's holding the value from the last time we ran this. So that means it's not making it into this last else if statement. So let's look at it. So if x is less than or equal to 0, and if x is greater than, if x is less than 0 and x is greater than 10, there is no number that is less than 0 and greater than 10, which means this and really needs to be an or. And that will make it any number less than 0 or greater than 10. Okay, and that will fix it. So now if we make this negative 20 instead, it should print the same message, which it does, and this should preserve everything. So if I switch it to 2, still works. If I switch it to 7, it also still works. Cool. Moving on, creating a new list. So we're using the append function here. Okay, we run this, and it says something about a tuple has no attribute append. So this is looking at line 5. Line 5 is new list dot append. Now it's saying a tuple object has no attribute append. The attribute append is the function that we're using, and it's saying that this new list is a tuple. Tuple is, if I right under this list, I can show you what a tuple is for those who don't know. A tuple is a parenthesis and then a whole bunch of numbers in it, followed by another parenthesis. It's different than a list, which means that you cannot change the tuple once it's created. Whereas a list, you can add more values or change what the values are. And so it's saying new list is a tuple. If we look up when we defined new list, we used parentheses instead of square brackets, which is where our source of our problem is. So we need to make sure those are square brackets. Now if we run it, we can see our new list has printed out like it should. Okay, moving on. Why isn't the result printing? So run this. You can see we have a for loop. We are going through the numbers and we're printing the numbers plus 1. Now, if we look down here, it's pointing at line 3. Line 3 is the for loop declaration, and it's saying list object cannot be interpreted as an integer. Okay, so a couple things can cause this. So it's looking for the thing that we want to be an integer. So that either means that x is not an integer like it should be, or that whatever we're passing into range is not an integer like it should be. Now, if you look at range, we're saying for the range of numbers. But that's not how range works. Range is looking for the length of numbers. So it's looking for however many numbers are in there. So we need to make sure that we're using this length to pass an integer into range. If we run this now, we are getting another error, but it's a different error. So now we're on to line 4. We made it down to line 4 where we're printing the numbers plus 1. Okay, so the error is saying can only concatenate a list, not an integer to a list. All right, and so what this is saying, it shouldn't be anything about concatenating. Concatenating a list means that we're still using a list for some reason. So if you look at what we're doing, we are taking numbers, which is a list that we have defined up here, and we're trying to add a 1 to the list of numbers. What we really need to be doing is indexing. So we have forgotten our index, and we need to be passing x into this numbers list right here. If we run that, you can see now all of our numbers have printed out. So that has now been taken care of. A few more examples here, and then we'll close out this bonus video. But why is the new list not printing? Okay, we will run this, and we're getting an error on line 6. Line 6 is this x dot append all of this stuff right here. So the product of the two lists. This is saying int object has no attribute append. What that means is it's thinking that this is an integer that has no function append. And integers don't have function appends, only lists do. So for some reason, this x is being treated as an integer instead of a list. If we look up at the top, we have defined x as a list. So that is not our problem. If we keep moving down, look for other places where x lives. So we are using a for loop, but we're using x to store the index for the list. So now instead of x being the list, x has been overridden to be, in this case, the very first value will be 0. And so when we go down here, x is no longer a list, x is equal to 0, and we're trying to append this to it. So different ways we can solve this. We could change what we're using to index within our list, or we could change what our list name is. So if I call this x's, and I say x's.append, we can run that. Okay, we are hitting another error, but we have gotten past this next part. We are on line 8 now. Object of type int has no length. So we're trying to take a length of an integer, and we're trying to take length of x. Again, we have changed the name of the list, but we didn't do it down here. So we need to change that one to x's as well. So now if we run this, yet another error, but we've made it past that other one, and we're on line 9 now. Again, same thing. Int is not scriptable, which means we did not change the name of our list. After changing all those, we finally have made it to the end where we have all of the values that we're looking for. All right, now we're using a while loop. If we run this, we are trying to print the list in reverse order. So we were able to print 8, but then something happened. So we made it at least through the while loop once. So list index is out of range. For some reason, when we're trying to get the list at this index, whatever this index may be, we are out of the range. So one way that you can actually help debug your script is just adding in some print statements. So for some reason, I is out of range. So let's see what I is. All right, the first value that we're trying to, the first value of I will be 7, which is the end of the list. Remember, the list is length minus 1 for the very last index. Okay, so the list at 7 is equal to 8, but something's happening where our new I value, so if I just make this a little cleaner and I print out this is equal to I, our new I value has changed to 8. If we look at our list, we don't have an index 8, which is right here after the 8. So for some reason, our index is going up instead of down. So we need to decrement our I value in order to go down through the list. And now when we do that, our list has been changed. We can delete that print statement, and we have printed the list in reverse order. Okay, last example I have here, we have this class for student. We're passing in a name and a grade, and then we're assigning those names and grades to variables. And then we're trying to print out, assign the student name and grade, and then print out the name and grade as well. So running this, we have a invalid syntax. And this is going to be on the very last line, our print statement right here. So print student.name, comma, student.grade. Followed by a ending parenthesis. Now, I don't see any syntax error with this line. However, since the caret is pointing to the beginning of the line, this hints to me that it has occurred before this line. So leading up to this line, we hit the error. So looking at the line before, student equals the class of student, and we're passing things in, it looks like we have forgotten our end parenthesis. So adding that in, rerunning it. Now you can see we've gotten past that, but we're on to back up to line 1. So we have this class that we're passing in a name and a grade. Name, grade is not defined. Okay, so something is wrong here. If you remember, when we're trying to define a class and pass in 2 values of name or grade, we need to be passing these values into the initialization function, not to the class. We haven't covered this, but when you pass something into the class, it's trying to inherit things from other classes. It's a little more advanced for classes, but remember, pass in those values to the init function. Running it again. Now we're down to line 7. Init takes 2 positional arguments, but 3 were given. All right, so looking at our initialization function, it takes 2 arguments, but 3 were given. This is a common error with classes, and this is something I forget all the time, and definitely beginners also forget all the time. When you're using a function within your class, you need to always pass in self. You're always going to pass in the class itself to the function. That's why 3 arguments were being passed in, but it really, 2 arguments were passed in, but it's looking for 3. So now 3 arguments are there. Run this. And we're back down to our very last line with our error. So student object has no attribute name. So for some reason, our initialization function, taking in name and grade, assigning name and grade. But if you remember using classes, if you want the variable to be assigned to the class, you need to say self.name, self.grade. If you don't do that, it's not going to be saved within the class. It's just going to be a temporary variable. Now if I run it, everything has been corrected. So I hope this was beneficial. Again, this is probably the most useful thing you're going to learn as a beginner is how to read your error messages, because you're going to be getting a lot of them and you're going to get frustrated, and the faster you can solve your errors, the better off you're going to be, and the more work you're actually going to be able to get done. So really look at what those errors are saying, where they're pointing, and try to work through them as best as possible. Definitely you can look at things like Stack Overflow if you really can't figure out what you're doing wrong. Other people are going to have the same problems, and I'm sure their answers are out there to be looked up. But for now, I'm going to end it here. We have one more video in this series, and then we will officially be done with our Python Bootcamp. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for joining, and I will see you in the next one.